In September 1944, thousands of British paratroopers descended into the Netherlands with a plan believed capable of ending the war within weeks, yet almost as soon as they hit the ground, something crucial disappeared, not the Germans, but the signal itself. Radios fell silent, units could no longer hear one another, orders failed to arrive, reports went nowhere. On the maps, everything still appeared to be on schedule, but on the ground, the war was moving faster than any plan could account for. Allied tanks were still advancing from the south, while at the front, British paratroopers were fighting a battle no one could see in full, and between those two ends of the operation lay a gap measured not in kilometers, but in silence, a silence in which a bridge called Arnhem slowly became the point where the entire campaign began to slip out of control. After the Allied forces broke through the Normandy front and advanced into Paris in 1944, the war in Western Europe entered a precarious and dangerous limbo. On the maps, German forces were retreating. In victory reports, Allied flags were flying over major cities. But beneath that surface, Germany's war machine had not yet broken. Key defensive lines still existed. Rail networks, bridges, and industrial centers had not been fully destroyed. And most importantly, the Rhine River, the last natural barrier before German territory, still stood there like a door that had yet to be opened. For the Allied High Command, the Rhine was not just a river. It was the line between a long, grinding war and an early end to the conflict. Every traditional method of crossing it demanded time, immense logistical effort, and a very high cost in blood. As public opinion and political pressure increasingly demanded a swift conclusion, the question was no longer whether to cross the Rhine, but how to do so before German forces had time to reorganize. It was in this moment that Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery put forward a proposal so bold that it immediately stirred controversy within the Allied camp. Rather than continuing a war of attrition along Germany's borders, Montgomery proposed bypassing the forward defences altogether, striking deep with airborne forces to seize key bridges in the Netherlands, opening a narrow but continuous corridor through which mechanized forces could drive straight into the industrial heart of the Ruhr. If everything unfolded according to plan, the war in Europe could be over before Christmas 1944. The plan was called Operation Market Garden, and from the moment it was presented, it carried the unmistakable character of a gamble. Market Garden was unlike any operation the Allies had conducted before. It was not built on step-by-step, overwhelming superiority. It lacked defensive depth, and it offered no clear contingency if its tempo were broken. The entire operation was designed as a single leap, one in which time, speed, and precise coordination down to the hour became matters of survival. The market phase of the plan envisioned dropping 3 airborne divisions deep behind German lines, spread across dozens of kilometers, with the mission of seizing key bridges from Eindhoven and Nijmegen to Arnhem. The garden phase consisted of a single ground thrust by the British 30 Corps, racing along the newly opened route, linking each bridge together like beads on a fragile string. That corridor had no tactical depth. If a single bridge were destroyed, or if one defending unit were driven off, the entire operation would grind to a halt immediately. Within that structure, British airborne forces occupied the most central yet most vulnerable position. The 1st Airborne Division was assigned the most dangerous task of all, to jump the deepest, the farthest, and to hold the most decisive objective, the road bridge at Arnhem, the bridge spanning the Rhine River. This was the end point of the Market Garden corridor. Without that bridge, there would be no strategic breakthrough, and there was no plan B if Arnhem fell. Unlike the American divisions dropped closer to their objectives, British paratroopers were forced to land 8 to 10 miles from Arnhem due to concerns over German anti-aircraft fire around the city. That distance was more than a geographical problem. It was a strategic risk accepted on one condition alone, that British airborne units could maintain speed and coordination throughout a long-foot advance across forests, villages, and complex urban terrain. And to do that, they had only one tool: radio communication. From the planning stage onward, radio became the only thread connecting units scattered across an enormous area. Battalions needed to stay in contact to consolidate formations and support one another under resistance. Brigades had to know the position of each advancing element in order to adjust routes and timing. Divisional headquarters had to track the entire unfolding battle to make timely decisions when events diverged from expectations. Without radio, Market Garden would not merely slow down, it would become blind. On paper, the communications system issued to British airborne troops was considered adequate. These radios had functioned in earlier operations. Training exercises had been conducted. Warnings about the long distance between drop zones and objectives, about the forests and urban terrain around Arnhem, did exist, but they were categorized as acceptable risks. In the optimistic atmosphere of September 1944, few believed that an operation mobilized on the scale of Market Garden could collapse, simply because its forces could no longer talk to one another. On the afternoon of the 17th of September 1944, as Dakota transports and gliders began to fill the skies over the Netherlands, Market Garden stepped off the map and into reality. British paratroopers landed around Wolfheze and Oosterbeek under relatively favorable conditions. Units quickly assembled, gathered their equipment, and began moving toward Arnhem. In those first minutes, everything still appeared to be under control. But as the units left the drop zones and pushed deeper into forests and built-up areas, the first signs of trouble began to appear. Radio signals weakened as the distance between units increased. Short transmissions were cut off. Some reports received no reply at all. At first, this did not cause panic. Commanders assumed it was temporary interference, believing that communications would be restored as the formations moved closer to Arnhem. They continued to advance according to the original plan, trusting that other units were doing the same. Time passed, and the silence lasted longer than expected. Battalions of the British 1st Airborne Brigade advanced along different routes, exactly as planned. Yet instead of converging near Arnhem, they were gradually stretched apart by the terrain, by German resistance appearing sooner than anticipated, and by the inability to adjust their routes based on the situation of neighbouring units. One column, led by Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, moved faster than the rest, and reached the Arnhem Bridge. Other columns were halted on the outskirts of the city. The problem was not that they were stopped, but that no one could tell anyone else. At the bridge, Frost received no information indicating that other units were in difficulty. At Oosterbeek, divisional headquarters received no reports confirming that Frost had reached his objective. Each side acted on the assumption that the other was still progressing according to plan. That gap in information began to produce flawed decisions, even though each individual decision seemed reasonable at the moment it was made. As night fell on September 17, Major General Roy Urquhart, commander of the 1st Airborne Division, realized that the reality on the ground no longer matched what he had been promised on the maps. The radios were still silent. Reports from the front failed to arrive. Units expected to converge around Arnhem appeared to have vanished from the command system. For an operation that depended entirely on speed, that silence was more than unsettling. It was threatening. Urquhart faced a difficult choice. If he remained at headquarters and waited for information that never arrived, he would lose more precious time. If he moved forward himself to grasp the situation firsthand, he might restore the chain of command, but at the cost of placing himself in danger. The decision he made reflected the severity of the communications problem. Urquhart left headquarters, accompanied by Brigadier Lathbury and a small group of aides, heading toward Arnhem in search of answers that the radio could not provide. That decision, born out of radio silence, opened an even more dangerous gap. Urquhart's vehicle column ran into a German ambush. In the chaos, he was forced to break away from his escort and take refuge inside a civilian house. For nearly 24 hours, the divisional commander was unable to communicate with anyone. Headquarters did not know where he was. Units in the field did not know who was in command. In an operation where every hour was calculated, an entire division was left without leadership simply because the radio had failed to fulfill its role. Meanwhile, at the Arnhem Bridge, Frost and roughly 700 of his paratroopers entered a different reality. There were no new orders, no information came from the rear. Frost understood that his mission was to hold the bridge until Allied tanks arrived, but there was no way to know where those tanks were, or whether they were still advancing at all. Every attempt to communicate by radio proved futile. Soldiers climbed to the highest floors of riverside buildings, trying to transmit signals farther. Flares were fired into the sky, but the sky offered no reply. The silence did more than sever command. It began to strangle logistics. According to the plan, starting on September 18, resupply flights were to drop ammunition, food, and medical supplies onto drop zones controlled by the airborne troops. But when the radio beacons used to guide those aircraft were destroyed, damaged, or captured by German forces, there was no way to signal that the drop zones were no longer secure. Supply aircraft released their loads according to the original schedule, while paratroopers on the ground were unable to say that they had been pushed out of those areas. Crate after crate fell, and crate after crate was collected by German troops. By this point, the loss of communications was no longer a technical issue. It had become a spiral. Radio silence led to decisions based on assumptions. Faulty assumptions led to units becoming isolated. Isolated units made the restoration of communications even less likely. With every passing hour, Market Garden drifted farther from its original course, not because of a lack of courage or firepower, but because no one could hear anyone else. As night fell over Arnhem on September 18, radio silence was no longer a problem to be fixed. It had become the condition under which the entire British airborne force was forced to operate. No one still expected the signal to suddenly return. Instead, every decision was now made in an information vacuum, where each commander could see only a small fragment of the larger picture and was forced to guess at the rest. In the Oosterbeek area, Major General Urquhart tried to re-establish command and control with whatever remained at his disposal. Staff officers gathered fragmented reports from units that could still be reached and stitched them together into a battlefield map that was more conjecture than reality. Positions were marked in pencil rather than ink, because no one dared assume they would still be accurate a few hours later. In that context, Urquhart was forced to make a strategically significant decision. Instead of continuing to probe toward Arnhem with scattered thrusts, he shifted the focus to holding a defensive perimeter around Oosterbeek, hoping that XXX Corps advancing from the south would break through in time. This decision did not stem from preference, but from a lack of alternatives. Without communications, coordinating a unified advance was nearly impossible. Compressing the formation allowed Urquhart to retain a minimum degree of control, but it also amounted to an admission that the original mission of relieving Arnhem was slipping beyond the division's capacity. Meanwhile, at the Arnhem Bridge, Frost and his force had entered the second day of a siege. German forces tightened the encirclement with artillery and tanks, steadily dismantling defensive positions within the urban area. Frost understood that every hour without relief reduced his unit's chances of survival. Yet there was no information that allowed him to judge whether reinforcements were on the way at all. In that state, Frost chose a form of combat aimed at preservation, counter-attacking only when necessary, conserving ammunition, and sustaining morale through the belief that they were still part of a larger operation. That belief was sustained largely by the discipline and spirit of the paratroopers rather than by any concrete evidence. Soldiers continued to adjust their radios, change batteries, swap antennas, and try every frequency they had been trained to use, only to receive meaningless bursts of static. Each time the radio fell silent, it did more than sever contact with higher command. It deepened the sense of abandonment. Elsewhere, around Oosterbeek, the situation unfolded along similar lines. Some small units were forced to withdraw step by step under German fire. Others tried to hold their ground to protect routes that might be used for resupply or relief. But without the ability to coordinate, these efforts rarely supported one another. One unit might sacrifice itself to hold a piece of high ground, while another unit only a few hundred meters away had already pulled back, believing that the position had fallen earlier. The loss of communications also distorted how British forces understood their opponent. Without reliable reports, Commanders were compelled to assess German strength based on the intensity of fire they encountered. This produced two extreme reactions, either underestimating the enemy and launching reckless attacks, or overestimating the threat and withdrawing earlier than necessary. German forces, by contrast, benefited from a more flexible command system, one in which local units were empowered to organize themselves and react quickly without waiting for orders from afar. The contrast grew sharper as one side's radios fell silent while the other maintained a minimum but continuous flow of information. September 19 marked a critical turning point, not because of a decisive battle, but because of a shift in perception at Allied headquarters. The first pieces of information, vague as they were, began to suggest that the situation at Arnhem was far more serious than anticipated. Yet, because these reports arrived late and lacked detail, they were not enough to prompt an immediate strategic adjustment. 30 Corps remained tied down in the fight for the bridges at Nijmegen, while British airborne forces to the north continued to be isolated. At Arnhem, Frost began to realize that time was working in the Germans' favor. Enemy counterattacks became more organized, targeting specific weaknesses in the defensive perimeter. Anti-tank ammunition was nearly exhausted, forcing paratroopers to face tanks with little more than standard infantry weapons. Every tactical decision now amounted to a choice between two risks: exhausting the force in an attempt to hold ground, or pulling back and allowing the enemy to advance another step. In that context, radio silence took on a different meaning. It did not merely prevent new orders from arriving, it also prevented the desperation of the real situation from being conveyed. Had Frost been able to report the true extent of his predicament, a more desperate decision might have been made from the south. But in the absence of information, all sides acted on the assumption that the situation remained under control. When the decision to surrender at Arnhem was made on the morning of September 21, it occurred in a space completely detached from the rest of the campaign. There was no coordination, no withdrawal order transmitted. Only the immediate reality that the force had exhausted its ability to fight. The final message was sent more as a symbolic gesture than as a genuine attempt at communication, because by that point the radio had become an inanimate object, no longer capable of fulfilling its purpose. After Arnhem fell, the silence did not disappear. It changed form. At Oosterbeek, Urquhart and his officers understood that the strategic objective of Market Garden was no longer achievable. Yet withdrawal could not take place immediately. It required preparation, cover, and at least a minimal degree of coordination with ground forces. In the days that followed, the remaining units of the division were forced to hold on, fighting while trying to preserve the last fragile channels of communication. When the final withdrawal was carried out on the night of September 25, it unfolded in almost complete silence. Soldiers crossed the Rhine under cover of darkness, leaving behind wounded comrades and prisoners, along with the entire original ambition of the campaign. That retreat, though conducted with a measure of order, still bore the marks of the preceding days: a lack of information, a lack of certainty, and a reliance on individual judgment rather than collective planning. When Market Garden officially came to an end, casualty figures and strategic outcomes were quickly compiled. But those numbers could not fully convey how the operation had collapsed. Market Garden was not defeated in a single decisive battle, nor did it fail because of one isolated mistake. It unraveled gradually, as radio silence eroded coordination, slowed reaction, and forced commanders to make decisions in the dark. Looking back at the entire campaign, it becomes clear that radio was not the sole cause of failure, but it was the catalyst that made every other mistake impossible to correct. The distance of the drop zones, the underestimation of German forces, the narrow supply corridor, all of these factors might have been adjusted if the flow of information had not been cut. Once the radios fell silent, Market Garden lost its ability to adapt, and from that moment on, failure became only a matter of time. Almost immediately after Market Garden ended, the search for responsibility began, and as so often happens after major defeats, the first targets were those that could not easily defend themselves. Within the British Army, Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, the overall commander of the airborne forces, made it clear that the collapse of the 1st Airborne Division was directly linked to the failure of communications. Criticism focused on the division's signals units, accusing them of weak performance, poor organization, and an inability to meet the demands of a complex operation like Arnhem. At the same time, another narrative quickly took hold, that British airborne radios were outdated, unsuitable for modern warfare, and incapable of functioning under the real conditions of the Dutch battlefield. These judgments were gradually reinforced by post-war studies. Military historian Peter Harklerode wrote that much of the responsibility for the failure of the 1st Airborne Division was attributed to the breakdown of wireless communications and the unsuitability of the radios issued to the division under campaign conditions. From a distance, this argument appears convincing. When units cannot talk to one another, defeat seems like an inevitable outcome. But for those who had held those radios in the streets of Arnhem, the story was far more complicated. From within the battle itself, a different perspective gradually emerged. Captain Lewis Golden, Assistant Chief of Staff for Signals of the 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem, wrote his memoir, Echoes from Arnhem, not to deny the defeat, but to challenge the way that defeat had been interpreted. Golden argued that the wireless networks had performed better than could reasonably be expected under circumstances in which the plan itself had placed them in an impossible position. In his view, the problem was not whether the radios functioned or not, but that they were being asked to do far more than their design limits allowed. To maintain stable communications between units spread across tens of kilometers, in forests, urban terrain, and under enemy fire. This interpretation gradually gained support among post-war specialists. Major John Greenacre, a British officer and military historian, reached a striking conclusion when he re-examined the entire campaign. On close inspection, he argued, it was difficult to understand why the breakdown of communications in the 1st Airborne Division was so often attributed solely to radio failure when the sets themselves were largely operating within their technical specifications. The core problem, according to Greenacre, lay in the structure of the plan itself. The initial distance between the drop zones and the objective was too great, the deployment too dispersed, and every course of action rested on the assumption that communications would always be available. When that assumption collapsed, the radio became a scapegoat for a plan that had exceeded its own limits of endurance. These debates went beyond the question of who was right or wrong and exposed a deeper flaw in contemporary military thinking, an almost total dependence on a single means of communication. At Arnhem, once the wireless system fell silent, British forces had virtually no effective alternative. The irony was that right beneath their feet existed another communications network, more primitive yet more resilient, the Dutch fixed telephone system. In 1944, the Netherlands possessed a relatively advanced telephone infrastructure, with multiple parallel networks still functioning despite German control. Local civilians and resistance members were able to splice lines, switch connections, and pass messages across occupied areas. In fact, the Dutch resistance itself used the telephone system to relay information about Arnhem to the Allies. On September 18, they called to inform the US 82nd Airborne Division that German forces were overwhelming the British at Arnhem. That information existed, the channel existed, yet the British at Arnhem made little use of it. The 1st Airborne Division did not attempt to transmit urgent requests for reinforcement through the civilian telephone network to Corps headquarters. The reasons may have been many: security concerns, unfamiliarity with local infrastructure, or a deep-rooted skepticism toward information outside official channels. Whatever the cause, the outcome was unchanged. When the radios fell silent, British forces confined themselves to that silence. That lesson becomes even clearer when set against the way the enemy operated. The German army applied the doctrine of Auftragstaktik, granting substantial autonomy to lower-level commanders so they could adapt to real conditions on the ground. When communications were disrupted, German units did not wait for orders. They reorganized on their own, forming flexible combat groups and responding quickly to changes on the battlefield. British forces, by contrast, were accustomed to a top-down system of detailed orders, in which uninterrupted information flow was a prerequisite for action. When that condition disappeared, subordinate units became hesitant and reactive, gradually slipping into a posture of desperate defense. Many historians argue that if British forces at Arnhem had been granted greater flexibility, they might have adjusted on their own initiative, by using alternative means of communication, narrowing their objectives earlier, or withdrawing once the situation became clearly untenable. Instead, they continued to hold on in the hope that new orders would arrive, that reinforcements were close at hand, and that the silence was only temporary. That period of waiting allowed German forces to complete their encirclement and crush each pocket of resistance in turn. Seen in historical perspective, the communications failure at Arnhem was not a single technical mishap, but the point where multiple flawed strategic choices converged. It directly led to British airborne forces being isolated, resupply failing, command becoming paralyzed, and the ability to coordinate the operation collapsing. Historian Anthony Beevor has noted that forests, buildings, and long distances rendered many British radios nearly ineffective, leaving the 1st Airborne Division and General Urquhart unable to direct the battle at Arnhem in any meaningful sense of the word command. Wireless communication was only one of many factors behind the failure of Market Garden, but it was the factor that would have allowed all the others to be corrected if time had remained. Once the flow of information was cut, the plan lost its ability to adapt. When that ability vanished, failure ceased to be a possibility and became a process. British paratroopers fought with unquestionable courage, but individual bravery could not substitute for a functioning information system. Market Garden thus left behind a stark lesson that reaches far beyond the bounds of this single operation. In modern warfare, where every plan depends on coordination and tempo, silence can be as dangerous as firepower. A campaign, no matter how bold, can collapse not in an explosion, but in the empty space between people who can no longer hear one another. And the image of soldiers at Arnhem, clutching a silent radio while surrounded, remains as a reminder that sometimes the force that decides the fate of an entire operation is not the enemy in front, but the voice that never arrives from behind.